Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Inconvenient Questions, a week in review podcast where we ask questions about a variety of cultural, economic, and intellectual topics which are politically inconvenient, and we let you determine who they are inconvenient for. My name is Clifford, and I am joined by my friend and practicing mathematician, Jeffrey. We are recording this episode on the evening of March 2nd, 2025, and boy, do we have an interesting discussion for you today. With the debacle in the White House that occurred between Zelensky and President Trump 2 days ago, fresh in the news cycle, we will be asking a very inconvenient question. Who exactly advised Zelensky to sabotage this meeting? Did Zelensky think that by bringing up previous problems with ceasefires with Russia in a very public setting in front of the news cameras, that he would be able to arrange a better deal for himself and Ukraine? Or is it perhaps the case that this was staged under the advice and encouragement of others who have ulterior motives in trying to get NATO more involved in Ukraine? Those are the inconvenient questions we'll be asking today. The thing that's just happened a few days ago that made all of the news headlines was this meeting with Zelensky and Trump, where it turns out that about an hour before that meeting, it is alleged that Chris Murphy advised Zelensky not to sign an agreement that would lead to a ceasefire with Putin. And so, I don't know. This guy seems like he's like being batted around all over the place. You've got a potentially an official acting under the Trump administration back in 2019 or 2020. I forget which it was, telling him not to come to an agreement. Boris Johnson allegedly doing the same thing, and then finally somebody from the great state of Connecticut advising Zelensky on apparently the nuances of unified government in the United States.
I find that difficult to believe. Nobody takes Chris Murphy seriously, and the idea that Zelensky would make a momentous decision based on the advice of this not terribly powerful American senator.
Well, I'm not suggesting that he took Chris Murphy's advice to heart. However, I would point out that this is Chris Murphy's Twitter feed that we're looking at, and this is Chris Murphy talking about a meeting with him where it appears that the meeting was about not coming to an agreement, right? And so I'm not suggesting that Chris Murphy is a persuasive person. I am just simply pointing out a thing that is not being posted by other people, but in fact by Chris Murphy himself.
I mean, I think that people who are just obvious narcissistic psychopaths like Putin and Murphy and maybe some other people are just people whose when they say things you don't want to really inquire into them too carefully, because the thing about self-serving fantasies is that just getting you to think about the fantasy gets them into your mind, and
yeah, I'm not too concerned about Chris Murphy. I do think he is becoming a bit of a front man right now for the anti-Trump sentiment in the Democratic Party, but I'm not too concerned about him. Although it would be nice if he was not the senator of anyone, let alone the residents of Connecticut.
That's really interesting. That's kind of an interesting observation, because that might be the case. And you would think that everybody, we have a lame duck president. You think that everybody would be jostling to be the front man, right? Everybody would want to be seen as the anti-Trump person if they're positioning themselves to 2020.
Well, Schumer's too old, right? Like he is the minority leader in the Senate, and sort of the age. He's the big Pumbaa right now in the party, right? He in the Senate side, but he's too old to make a realistic run in the next election. Whereas Chris Murphy is 51, so he's at a great time to sort of elevate his own career, or for other people to elevate his visibility as they have done throughout his career. He has no other occupation, by the way. He graduated from law school and went directly for working for the Democratic Party in Connecticut. Got elected to his first office as a House representative in, I believe it's the north, like somewhere in the northwest of Connecticut, where he went to high school. And he got elected at 25, worked his way to the Senate in Connecticut, then worked away as a House representative in the federal government, and then he took over, I believe it was Joe Lieberman's seat after a
Right.
somewhat contested election with Linda McMahon. It was the two of them
Right.
that were
Two giants of Connecticut
well. I
politics.
think that
Absolutely.
yeah.
When
Sorry.
I say that Chris Murphy is a psychopath, I'm not trying to insult him or
We're clinically
put
diagnosing him. We both have
medical terms
advanced
onto
degrees.
politicians. No, I literally mean no, I literally mean that he's a clinical psychopath. I literally mean that he has all of the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder and all the aspects of the dark triad.
Well, if you're going to make a statement, I think you need to back it up with at least one or two tidbits of information that would make it so that.
Well, okay. Here's one tidbit. I mean, he campaigned against the death penalty, and the first opportunity he had to expand the death penalty, he voted for. Right? That's not a normal. That 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 that, that's not something that a normally healthy person would do. And it wasn't even it wasn't to bolster his anti-crime credentials or anything, because he doesn't really have any, and his constituents don't demand one. His party wanted to expand the death penalty, and he voted to expand the death penalty because it was expedient to do so.
Okay, I don't know if that really qualifies as psychopathic behavior. It sounds like you could also say that he was that the wisdom of his fellow party members showed him that his initial position may have been misguided, and he was persuaded by their.
That's a possibility, but observing him and observing his demeanor at the time, it was just complete, his normal charming, persuasive self just switched switched off the idea that killing people was
Okay,
wrong.
well, so let's run with the charming part, because I think that gets closer to the psychopaths. Because if somebody is clinically psychopathic, usually that means that they have a charming side, and they can switch. They can, at the flip of a switch, go from charming to like monstrously mean, right? Like, isn't that a typical trait of somebody with psychopathy?
Right. An example of that is after the fall of Kabul, when 60 uh, Connecticut teenagers were stuck in Afghanistan and unable to get out because the Taliban wouldn't let them out. They were from his old district, I believe, and the rest of the Connecticut delegation was screaming bloody murder to Biden, and Murphy was completely out of the picture. He didn't want to be seen to cross the party leader in any way.
Okay.
I mean, not he wouldn't meet with the parents of the teenagers, for
So that's
example.
the callous
That's not
indifference
normal
is
behavior.
is is another key component
Yeah.
of psychopathy. I mean, I've seen it with certain politicians. They can go from amiable, and collegial in one setting, and then, like, a different committee meeting just a day later or an hour later, they can be they can raise their voice and act like the most self-righteous, aggressive behavior, and it's like they just have complete emotional control over how they behave, and they always choose the one that's
Yeah. So I guess
that's convenient for their own ends, right?
right, but politician that's often learned behavior, right?
Well, it's
That's not
it's
necessarily a sign
evolved,
of
right?
a
It's
personality
evolved.
disorder.
You, yeah, those who do it well seem to be able to to succeed, outperform the people who are just nice people, or just mean people, right? You got to be
Yeah.
both. In the in the words of the Machiavellian, or sorry, in the words of the Prince, right? You got to learn how to be both. In any case, to bring it back to this issue with Zelensky being acting as a sort of like I don't know punching bag, but I'm not sure that that's really the case here. I wanted to bring up Chris Murphy because I was trying to establish that there's a sort of line of people who have been advising him about not signing a peace agreement with Putin, and I also wanted to add to the mix the chief of staff for Zelensky, a guy named Andriy Yermak. And apparently, Andriy Yermak, uh, he was the one that was insistent. He insisted that Zelensky meet Trump in person because the recent deal that went south or sideways, maybe it's still on, but in any case, it's the one that created the scene and the imbroglio that everybody's talking about. That appears to have been negotiated by a retired General Keith Kellogg or something. And at that point in time,
Uh,
it was negotiated. And what we hear from Scott Bessent is that when he met with Zelensky, Zelensky refused to sign the agreement. Then he had another meeting with J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, which once again, Zelensky refused to sign the agreement because it sounds like this his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, was heavily encouraging him to meet with President Trump in the Oval Office. And I could, in an innocent way, I could understand why he might want to do that. You know, the optics, the handshake, right? Like the ability to meet with Trump. Maybe he doesn't want, you know, he's the president of Ukraine. I could see where somebody who is advising Zelensky to meet with Trump to make sure that when it comes to this deal, that it's not him negotiating with the secretaries under Trump, but as a head of state against another head of state. That makes sense to me, right? However, when you
uh,
see what happened, the fact that Zelensky basically sabotaged it by the way that he talked, right?
oh, Yermak is the Ukrainian head of state.
No, Andriy Yermak is the chief of staff for President Zelensky, isn't he?
He's the head of the office of president. Isn't he the? Isn't that the? I thought that was the head of. So is Zelensky the head of state of?
Well, considering that there haven't been elections, it's not entirely clear who is officially the head of state. But
Well, that's true too. I'm sorry. I misunderstood how the constitution in the Ukraine works.
okay, so
Go on. But there's another explanation about why he would want to have Zelensky meet in the White House. If Yermak, who negotiated the deal, thinks this is the best they can do, and Zelensky thought they could do better, it would be natural to try to get your boss to meet with Trump and publicly be associated with the treaty to convince him to be on board with
yes,
it.
and so I wanted to ask you this question, and the inconvenient question that I'm actually asking is who advised Zelensky to sabotage the Oval Office handshake? Because I think Trump was under the impression that the reporters were there for the typical head of state handshake, right, where they say positive things about each other, and Trump says very positive things to other heads of state when he needs to, right? Like he has said positive things about
Uh,
Xi, he's said positive things about Putin, he said positive things about Starmer, right? Like there are, when it comes to the publicity side of things, President Trump usually doesn't act this way, and so he acted in a way that can kind of indicate that he was a bit surprised by the pushback. And when you listened to what actually Zelensky said, it was an insinuation that Putin cannot be trusted, and because he was trying to talk about how Putin had signed ceasefires in the past and had not, had not kept them, right? Like that the fighting had continued anyway. And so it seems innocuous, right? Based off of the fact that Zelensky doesn't raise his voice and he is, expressing a concern that he has. But it's very clear that Trump was not expecting that to happen because of all this work that had already been done to make the arrangement. So this was it may have been subtle, but it was still a sabotage because he basically indicated to Trump that he doesn't trust Putin, And so Trump's like, why are we even here? And if that's the case, why did you choose to do this in front of reporters? And my belief is that this was all staged to either get Trump to pick a side, right? To either say, "Oh yeah, that you're right. Trump, Putin hasn't actually abided by his previous agreements, right?" Which is, I think, what the
Mhm.
people who have been supporting Zelensky would really love to hear, or maybe what they would love to hear even more is a complete rejection of that idea, and Trump say something in the effect of, "I believe Putin's correct," right? Like, but it was clear that this meeting was, even though Trump was the one that was very vocal, Zelensky was the one that was deliberately pushing buttons. And when you look at the fact of all the advice that he has, this is why I bring it up. And I haven't been able to do the proper research. So as a result, I can't really answer this question right now. But I do have.
Isn't there
Sorry.
isn't there but isn't there a more reasonable, more direct explanation about what the argument was about? I mean, the whole idea of the treaty is that the United States will invest in uh, um, uh, rare earth metals in the Ukraine, and in particular, the DoD will invest. This is a program uh, from left over from the Biden administration, and that this would be a deterrent to Russia if there's an American DoD investment in the Ukraine. But that's not what Zelensky wants. What Zelensky wants is our NATO troops in the Ukraine to act as tripwire, and that's what they were arguing about, and it's also uh, the central point of contention between the governments of the United States and Ukraine right now. So isn't it more natural to assume that Zelensky was either uh, acting out of frustration because of the disagreement, or acting sneakily to try to change the game in this negotiation between him and Trump?
Yes, I am not suggesting that I have enough information to understand the intent of Zelensky. For the sake of this conversation, I think that we should at least just assume that Zelensky has the best interest of Ukraine in mind, and that even though he, is past his term, he still is operating as its president for the interests of Ukraine. I don't necessarily. I'm not sure if I believe that, but I think that we should actually just assume that for now. And if that is the case, then he certainly could and probably should, in its interest, try and get the best deal that he can. And by doing so in a public setting, he might be able to get a better deal. Perhaps he's using Trump's tactics against Trump. That is possibly one interpretation of what transpired. And I think that may or may not work. I don't really think that's the reason for what we saw, but I guess it is an alternative explanation, which is why ultimately we're asking questions. So let me give you the reason that I think that we saw what we saw, and it's not
Well,
like I have answers. It's actually the reason that I'm going to give you is another question. My question is, what do all these people that I've mentioned have in common? What does Andriy Yermak, Chris Murphy, Boris Johnson, and Alexander Vindman have in common? This is me interrupting in post. When I said Alexander Vindman, I actually meant Bill Taylor. Bill Taylor was the ambassador to Ukraine between 2006 and 2009, but the question of his involvement with Zelensky comes from when he was the U.S. charge d'affaires right after Zelensky's election in 2019. And I haven't done the network mapping to be able to answer that question. But my suspicions are that there's greater overlap and commonality here than simply they all happen to be here, be involved in Ukraine, right? That there are interests behind the scenes that have been, I guess you might say, pushing Zelensky in a specific direction that don't involve concession of territory. And so, even though it's entirely possible that Zelensky is doing this out of in good faith to get the best deal he can for Ukraine, my suspicion is that that's not actually what's going on. What's going on is that there are a number of people who are working semi in concert behind the scenes to perpetuate this arrangement that seems to be occurring, right? That
This arrangement.
NATO involvement in Ukraine.
Oh,
If that's what you think he wants, if you think he
yeah,
wants NATO tripwires, that would just be a realization of what everybody de facto knows is happening anyway. Because when U.S. troops are required to operate the U.S. missiles that the Ukrainians are firing into Ukraine, or when British intelligence is required to operate the Storm Shadows, right? So we've got a variety of different long range missiles that have been given to Ukraine, and those things can't be operated by the Ukrainians alone. Not because the Ukrainians don't know how to operate equipment, because literally the intelligence behind them
we don't give them the codes
is
for it.
being provided
Yeah,
by
right.
Americans. So NATO's involved, right? Like it's there. And it's just
Right.
not involved in some visible, UN peacekeeper blue helmet shoot at me and then there's an international incident kind of way. It's semi covert, right? It's sort of a low simmering involvement, and
I don't think it's semi-convert. It's publicized, and Congress actually has a line item. It's about $35 billion for over 2 years to subsidize NATO involvement in helping the Ukraine. I think
And
there
so
is.
I think the commonality here is NATO. I think there's something going on with NATO and all of these different people that's connected to the way in which the Polish, the Ukrainians, the people in Britain, and certain American influences are connected to like NATO and the way in which NATO has been used to pursue specific military agendas for a long time. And Ukraine is just sort of in the crossfire right now.
Almost everything's happening through NATO, so that's natural, right? But there is the question is, Trump wants the Europeans to be paying for more of the weapons that they're sending to the Ukraine, right? And the Europeans want the current situation, the current arrangement to keep going, and the Ukrainians want a physical presence for NATO troops in the Ukraine to act as a tripwire and as a guarantee so that foreign investors will feel confident. And Russia doesn't want any of that. So certainly NATO is the fulcrum of what everybody wants and doesn't want
Well,
right now
I'll propose an
in the whole
alternative
situation.
that nobody seems to be talking about, because apparently the alternative must be impossible or absurd. This seems to have started not on account of the fact that NATO is involved or in Ukraine or wants to expand Ukraine, although that certainly has been an ongoing narrative about Ukrainian entrance into NATO. I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that Ukraine itself as a country is divided between those pro-Russian and pro-European factions. And so my point is, why is nobody talking about just having the EU add Ukraine to it? Like, that's a solution.
I um yeah, that's an interesting observation.
Nobody wants it. Nobody wants it because they want the U.S. to pay for it, right? Isn't that the real answer? And that's what I'm trying to get at: is that NATO is just a smokescreen for
Yeah.
geopolitical arrangements that are going on behind the scenes. NATO is just like the visible side of it. It's geopolitical arrangements.
First of all, I find it difficult to believe that there's any pro-Russian faction with any large numbers or influence in Ukraine now. I mean, the Russians can't even get people to run to be appointed to positions in the areas that they occupy, which is supposedly the pro-Russian parts of the territories. They've had virtually no recruiting of men um, from from those areas into the Russian forces, whereas many men from those areas have moved east and joined the Ukrainian army. Uh, but there certainly is, looking at the Ukrainian press, there certainly is a divide between people who want peace right now and people who want to keep fighting, right? I think that's the fault line. And
Well, when I said the difference between EU and Russian, I mean going back multiple decades. Because if you look at the politics within Ukraine
oh yeah,
prior to Zelensky being elected, there was there has been a electoral divide between East and Western Ukraine, and there's also a regional divide between northern, western, and southeastern Ukraine on a industry oligarchy clan basis as well that existed.
mhm.
The facts on the ground from that point of view have changed, and so what you're describing to me is actually the fulfillment of what I'm suggesting. If you believe that at this point, as a result of this war, that there's actually very few Russian interests remaining in Ukraine, people who identify
I don't think there were before the war either, right? There were
I don't think that there were right before the war, but I think if you go back in time, you will see that
2000, maybe in 2014, maybe before the first
yes.
invasion,
So my point is
right?
that if it is currently the case and has been the case for a decade that Ukraine has been, for lack of a better term, de-Russified, why not add Ukraine to Europe? Because that's the only other faction that's in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And if
Oh,
that's the only people in Ukraine that vote anymore, because everyone either has gone to Russia or
right.
left, then why not add it to the EU? Why does the EU not incorporate Ukraine? It doesn't have to be a conversation about NATO, but it's always about a conversation about NATO.
One one problem is that to advance to EU membership, you need a referendum, and it's not obvious that a majority of people would vote to join the EU. I mean, they didn't vote to advance the last time they had
Do you mean in the EU or do you mean in Ukraine?
it in the Ukraine.
Well, you just told me that it's been de-Russified, right? Or that I use that term, but you
Well, you can be de-Russified and not want to be a colony of Europe. Is what I don't think that's what the situation would be, but that's what some people in the Ukraine seem to think would happen if they were to be a candidate
in,
for
in any
joining.
case, the conversation is just not on the table. Nobody's talking about it, and I find that that's peculiar.
Right. It's interesting that Trump isn't talking about it, for example. You're right.
I find it very peculiar because it makes much more sense from a cultural point of view, considering how many refugees in Ukraine have gone to other EU countries. So those people, if they joined
That's
the
true.
EU, would be able to
That's true.
easily come back to Ukraine. The people that identify with
Right.
Russia have largely left Ukraine at this point, right? So as a result, it's really the fact that the EU probably has a very arcane mechanism for having people join it. And on top of that, the EU also has, I believe, a schedule for joining that if the Ukraine were to join sooner than the countries that are already on the sort of queue, they have like a line, right? Like there's a line of countries, and
Right.
if Ukraine was suddenly put to the top of the line, these other countries would have a hissy fit, right? Because they're like, we're waiting, and
Well, also they need the people who are on the line and the order that they're in the line required unanimous consent from all of the EU members.
yes.
And as the EU's gotten bigger and bigger, that's gotten more and more complicated, right?
And so I am not suggesting that there aren't significant difficulties, but what I'm suggesting is that nobody wants to talk about that because everybody is insistent upon this question of NATO. And I'm assuming I don't actually have, maybe you know the answer to this question. Do you need unanimous consent to enter NATO?
Yes. Yes, because Finland and Sweden, Turkey didn't want to let Sweden in. It took a lot. It took a lot of American.
So that argument against joining the EU is no different, right?
Right. Right.
Okay, so we can cross that as an excuse off the list. Let's look at like whether or not Ukraine's population matches NATO's profile more or less than the EU profile, right? I mean, what is NATO somehow a more culturally affine institution than the EU is when it comes to integrating Ukraine? Do you?
I really do think it is. I think that the EU is very diverse, and look at some really strange cases like Malta and Hungary that operate just fine in the EU, and um I think, but NATO on the other hand, you have to agree to be part of the NATO command structure, and you have to have a plan to get your standards, training standards up to NATO standards. Um, yeah, I think NATO would be something that would take a decade to accomplish, whereas the EU is something that could conceivably, if everybody agreed out with it, if a majority of people voted for it in the Ukraine, and you got a unanimous consent from all the countries in the EU, it could happen tomorrow, right?
So my point in bringing this up is to suggest that there are choices, there are alternatives, and that it doesn't have to be portrayed as a question of whether or not we're going to have NATO troops as tripwires to enforce a ceasefire agreement, or whether
I agree. I agree completely, but doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in Ukraine agrees, right? Because they
I,
had
I'm suggesting that what Ukrainians believe right now is actually pretty low on the totem pole of why this is occurring.
true, but it also, but you have to understand that any agreement that ends the war has to have the buy-in of the Ukraine and Russia. Otherwise, it's pointless.
Oh, for sure. And I'm not suggesting that you can't that a ceasefire will last if one of the parties to the ceasefire wants to undo it. However, I would be curious to press you on whether or not that matches the current state between North and South Korea. And so I think that there is a way that human beings and nations can come up with unusual arrangements when they get creative. And if your interpretation is that this was ultimately a dispute over whether or not the DoD being involved in refining industries of rare earth metals in Ukraine was going to be sufficient to deter Putin, or whether NATO troops being stationed in Ukraine was going to be necessary to deter Putin, as being the key, element of what is going on here, I think that there's some evidence to that, but I feel like that's very superficial, because I feel like what's missing is this discussion about the fact that the EU could instead be the one that provides security guarantees by incorporating it. Or and this is where I would prefer to go. I would like to look at what do all of these people that have been advising Zelensky against signing a peace agreement for many years have in common. Why are they doing this, right? Why do they want NATO
I
to be
think
involved?
you talk about like, stop. We have to back up and look, have a reality check here. What would an EU security agreement look like? The EU's Joint Strike Force is smaller than the Connecticut National Guard, and not as well armed, right? I don't think the Connecticut National Guard would hold up very well to Russia in a pinch, and I doubt that the Rapid Response Force would do anything to deter Russia if they wanted to restart the war. A tripwire that doesn't trip anything is worse than no tripwire at all.
Okay, so now I think we're getting to the heart of it, which is that I think that the reason that EU is not on the table is because the EU doesn't have any military.
Right, right. Whereas, as
And so that gets me back to the whole freaking point, which is that, that the reason that the EU is not on the discussion is because NATO has been the donkey for a lot of different interests in Europe for a very long time. And the US, being the major contributor to NATO, has been the tax donkey for all of these interests, right? And so what
right,
we've seen is that there's
right,
a variety of different interests in Ukraine that seem to really want NATO to be involved, i.e., the US to be involved in it. and they don't give a crap about Ukraine, right? Like it's not about the death of Ukrainians. It has something to do
Well,
with,
who are they? I'm sorry, I'm confused. Who are they?
in this case, the what I'm suggesting is that Andriy Yermak, Chris Murphy, Boris Johnson, and Alexander Vindman, once again, not Alexander Vindman, but Bill Taylor, all are connected to a group of people who have an interest in NATO being involved in Ukraine, regardless of whether or not that leads to peace and stability. Because there were multiple occasions where Zelensky could have negotiated a peace with Putin that were deferred by these people. And so as a result,
First of all, you're expecting me to buy into the idea that there's anything that any of these people could have done to stop the war in 2022. I don't think that's the case. I think that it was a war that was entirely the result of internal Russian political actions, and it was a war of necessity by a single man, Putin, for his own internal reasons that had nothing to do with anything that Zelensky could ever have done.
I agree.
It was just so completely the propaganda and the preparations for war were so completely divorced from reality that nothing that Zelensky could have done would have stopped
Oh
the,
no,
the,
no.
the juggernaut.
None of these incidences involve pre-February 2022 peace negotiations, and I am in 100% agreement with you, and I am in disagreement with a number of people who think that NATO provoked this fight. I am 100% in disagreement with those people because I think that Putin did this for internal political reasons, right? But that doesn't mean that there weren't internal political reasons in Ukraine or in Poland or Britain or the United States that also have a role to play in the sequence of events. And what I am
Well, it's no, of course, that has to be the case because it's so important to the survival of each of those and well-being of each of those countries, right? No, war is something that everybody has strong opinions on, not necessarily informed opinions, but strong opinions.
And so what has been alleged is that there was a opportunity in April 22 after the Russian invasion sort of turned into a bit of a debacle, and it became clear to Putin that he was misled by his intelligence services about the ease with which he would accomplish the goals that he had in mind, that Putin may have been willing to settle with like a certain state of the battlefield at that point in time. And it is alleged that Boris Johnson, on his visit
Well,
to Kiev, dissuaded Zelensky from pursuing that option. It's also alleged that the territory that Russia occupied at that time was not what it will end up occupying should a ceasefire that is negotiated right now come about.
but you see, you're just assuming things without any evidence. What's the evidence that Putin was misled by his intelligence services? I don't think he was. He was misled by his army, that the army was ready to fight, right? He thought they had more tanks. He thought they had trucks
Yeah.
whose tires would hold out, right? He was misled to think that all of his artillery shells would fire, and that that his tanks had adequate anti-drone measures, and that wasn't something that in the fog of war. That's something that wouldn't immediately be apparent to Putin even after the failure of the initial invasion. And he behaved as if he thought there were temporary setbacks, right? Dedicating more resources, more money. But for over a decade and a half, you know, the Russian state was essentially a kleptocratic state, right? It was taking assets like Gazprom and other and large agricultural concerns, um, parceling them out to party favorites, and then you receiving tax revenues that went to buy things that were often just Potemkin villages. I mean, MRI machines with no insides to them, that sort of thing, like bandages that weren't sterile, I mean, they've been reduced to buying artillery shells now from North Korea, right? I mean, I don't think it would have been immediately apparent that this was going to be the case. He probably thought he had plenty of ammunition for the battle ahead, even though the battle seemed to be harder than he thought at the beginning.
Yeah, and so you and I have talked about the internal political arrangements in Russia in the past, and we've also talked about the sorry state of the Russian military. I follow a channel, Perun, which does a very good job at, I believe, assessing
Yes,
the logistics behind a variety of different militaries around the world, with a special attention on this war that's going on. And so I do not think that Russia is in a position of ultimate strength. I think that based off of the data that we have, that Russia has lost a lot of the, I guess, stockpiles that it had accumulated, and that if it weren't for the fact that China and Iran and North Korea have been assisting it in various different measures, I don't think that the industry in Russia would be able to keep up with the war.
no. But on the other hand, we can't either. In other words, the West can't either, right?
That has fueled a narrative in the West by people who are aware of the intelligence but have a political agenda that if we just keep on fighting, eventually Putin will crumble. And the thing that I'm trying to highlight here is that this is not necessarily asking what is in the best interest of the U.S. taxpayer, of the American citizen, of the people who voted for their current president. This is really a narrative that's coming out of Europe, and it's being put into our system by people who I think probably benefit from the current arrangement and or the this further NATO involvement, because I think what we know is that even if Russia can't sustain this indefinitely, it's sure as hell that Ukraine and the EU cannot without the involvement of the United States. So then Trump is asking an important question. What's in it for us, right? And he might be crude about it. He might be like, well, at least let's get some minerals, right? But actually, his tactic is pretty savvy because it's not about the minerals. It's about putting a interest of the United States in the country that would be sufficient to potentially ward off Putin, who would not be in a position to continue this fight if it got worse, right? If he actually moved against the things that the U.S. has an interest in, and so I don't know. I mean, from my perspective, I think that what we saw was a staged event where Zelensky sabotaged the discussion. You think that he did that as a method of bargaining, and it's possible that it was that this was him trying to use a approach against Trump that was similar to Trump. But I actually think this is the result of him believing that he has more support in the rest of the world than like essentially with the rest of the world and with the public, like with public opinion, and basically you know, trying to either get embarrass Trump or to get Trump to do something that is ultimately not in the interest of the United States.
Is it possible to embarrass Donald Trump?
That's a good point. I don't think. I mean, certainly, if you watch SNL or you go on any mainstream media, the opponents of Trump were very quick to jump on this particular incident and use it as a way to make Trump look like a bully, right? Because they clip the scenes in such a way so as to omit the statements that Zelensky made, and they don't mention the fact that essentially he had deferred signing this agreement multiple times so as to do it publicly, and then essentially picked a fight with Trump in front of reporters, right? So there's a great degree of disingenuousness here. Now, it's possible that this was just a bargaining tactic, but I actually think it fits more within the MO of somebody who has found a coalition of people who support him. This is Zelensky, that is primarily based in the Democratic Party and various different actors within Europe that want the United States to basically shoulder the cost of this expedition of theirs, for which I believe that there is mounting evidence that there is corruption and kickbacks and a variety of other things going on that don't entirely indicate that this is either an honest endeavor nor an endeavor that's for the interest of the United States. And that's what I'm trying to say here, right? Like,
I think that that might be true, and if so, I think it would be very surprising because Zelensky has always struck me as somebody who, you know, uh, who's pretty savvy. I mean, there already was broad bipartisan support in both houses of Congress and in the country at large for supporting Ukraine, and we have a very tightly divided Congress, two houses that are both tightly divided, and Zelensky's behavior really makes it very difficult for Trump to get Congress to allocate money to the Ukraine now. And that's something that I think would be obvious to anybody just at a glance. So I think it's perfectly possible what you're saying, but it's also just possible that Zelensky has trust in the current administration to be able to fulfill its promises. He just wants a better deal, a deal that involves U.S. troops, boots on the ground, or even better, French and German and British troops on the ground. Uh,
well, I
because
believe that J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth have been very clear that Ukraine can have as many British, French, and did you say German troops on the ground as they want, right? I mean, but there was a caveat to that.
What was the caveat?
The U.S. would not consider those troops to be Article 5 like worthy.
Right. So that it's never having troops that would be like Article 5 worthy. I'm not sure how to say that would be tantamount to the Ukraine being a member of NATO. Right.
Correct. And so Pete Hegseth was very clear a couple of weeks ago. J.D. Vance was very clear a couple of weeks ago when they went to Europe and talked with NATO and talked with European leaders that the United States has no interest in having its troops in Ukraine, and this could be a bargaining position, right? I mean, this is entirely possibly a bargaining position, right? Like to get a peace deal, right? The U.S. could eventually change its mind and have a different solution, which is why this whole rare earth steel, which sounds very odd, actually kind of when you think about it, actually ends up being somewhat creative because it sort of allows them to maintain that there are no troops there, but that there are sufficient interests by the U.S. military that is essentially like it could potentially act as a deterrent without having the actual troops there. But
we had hundreds of soldiers in the Ukraine when the Russians invaded, and it didn't deter them at all.
And I'm not suggesting that I know what Putin will or will not do. I do think that Putin's agenda is, as you said, a reflection of his own need to maintain authority within Russia. And I think we've talked in the past about how Putin sort of won the game of politics for his life out of this arrangement. That what has happened as a result of this conflict is that pretty much every closet anti-Putin person has been discovered, and
right,
and so
right, they've emptied out the cupboards and seen where the moths are.
Yeah, like it might be the case that their stockpiles are empty, but for the same reason, the entire house is empty. You've looked in every closet, you've looked in every cupboard, you looked in the basement, you looked in every wine cellar. You've looked in every spot that there could potentially be somebody that doesn't like Putin, and and there's no one left, right? So So I am not a fan of Putin's kleptocratic form of government, and I do not share the opinions about Putin that of a number of people that I follow and who I think have some interesting insights into the operations in Ukraine. I think that if you look at Putin, you can see that this invasion fits within a MO that is politically expedient for him, and also seems to have a very eerie similarity to previous special operations that he engaged in. Right?
Mhm.
What? How many countries or regions has this been at this point? Can you name them since
Well, gosh, it's well, we have the Ukraine obviously, and
one and two,
Abkhazia,
right?
Abkhazia. I don't really count Georgia because I don't think that was really something that the Russians did on purpose. I think that was a both sides blundered into that war. But after, his behavior, his behavior at the end of that conflict should have told everybody just exactly what we're dealing with here. Um, and of course, just the Dagestan and Chechnya, know, just whole cities just leveled and depopulated. I mean, and everybody just shrugged.
Wasn't there something in Kyrgyzstan too?
Uh, I don't. Yeah, but that was sort of at the invitation of the Kyrgyzstan government.
Okay.
Um, I don't know if I would count that as Russian aggression, but just general general nastiness in general.
But it was about securing Russian interests in regions around Russia.
I think Kyrgyzstan, he went there because he wanted to enforce the idea that Russia is the big hand on the block in Central Asia. Um, Russia doesn't have the Russia doesn't have the resources and didn't even back then to really be a colonial power in Central Asia, but he didn't want to be seen as a counterweight to China, to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan.
So in any case, if you like look at the series of sort of special operations, whatever the Russians decide to call it, and how who was involved, what was the outcome, who and how that connects to the mechanisms of maintaining power in the Kremlin, I think that what you can see out of that is that this is not NATO provocation, right? Like to sort
No,
of
right,
counter
right.
the narrative that people who are suspicious of this NATO involvement. So the people in that are primarily out there, whether it's mostly in social media, but you also see it in conservative mainstream stuff. There's this idea that NATO provoked Putin to invade Ukraine, right? Like that's the narrative that is separate from the stand with Ukraine narrative, right? That a democratic, peaceful people was innocently invaded by their horrible neighbor, and they've been fighting this war for a decade now, and we need to all pitch in for the sake of democracy and standing up to dictatorships because, by golly, we don't want to have another Munich conference where we just let another dictator tell us what to do and take over all of Europe, right? Like the stand with
But
Ukraine narrative.
we did let a dictator tell us what to do, right? That's how we got to the point of 2022. If we had stood up to Russia in 2014, none of this would have.
Well, so maybe it's not the it's the but it's the never again, right? It's the oh we
Right,
like this is finally our drawing line, the
right,
line
right.
that we're
Next
drawing in
time,
the
never
sand.
again.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Right.
Like, but in any case, so you have the stand with Ukraine narrative, and I think on the other side, I see this NATO provocation narrative. And what I'm suggesting is that I think both you and I share a more nuanced view, which is that the invasion was the result of complex kleptocratic mechanisms within Russian political structures, right? And
Kleptocratic mechanisms is hard to say.
certainly I tried to say it three times there, but that that internal political factors influence Putin's decision making far more than the West is willing to give it credit. That is the end of part 1 of our discussion. In part 2, we will be looking into Russian involvement in Syria and Africa, U.S. interests in Europe, and the cost of global deterrence, as well as a number of other topics. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this conversation, please like the video and subscribe, or leave a comment if you have inconvenient questions of your own. Thanks.